Hi guys, welcome back to Did You Know? So excited to have you here. Today we are going to talk about why the Jewish people don't sacrifice anymore, whether it's for sins, guilt offerings, sin offerings. Why aren't they doing that in the temple anymore?
Oh, yeah, that's a great topic. So the sacrificial system was instituted, obviously, during the time of Moses. And there's some specific reasons why God made them. And a lot of times people don't think about it. It seems like, wow, if you read Leviticus, there's all these sacrifices, and it seemed like a lot of work. And what was the purpose? And really, I think you can boil it down to one word. The word is a Hebrew word. The Hebrew word is korban.
Okay, I'm really glad because for a second there I almost said like, let's see if I get it, let's see if I get a point, and I was just not going to get
No.
that. My answer was Jesus. So
Yeah, well, it's
he
actually
truly is
very
the answer for
connected.
everything. So.
Yes, of course. So the word korban is translated as sacrifice or offering, right? Korban. But the word korban, the root word, comes from the word which means draw close. Karov is close. Likrov is to draw close. So what does that have to do with sacrifices? Well, the whole purpose of the sacrificial system was for the people to be able to draw close to God. Why?
Wow.
Why does
So
God want people to draw close to Him?
because he loves us.
Yes,
Yes.
exactly. And so, why are sacrifices necessary in order to draw close to God? Well, the obvious answer is because of sin, right? So, part of God's covenant with Israel, going back to time, Exodus, Egypt, Exodus from Egypt, Sinai, Ten Commandments. What follows after the Ten Commandments are all the ways that God intended for the people of Israel to stay in right relationship with God. And the big part of that is through the sacrificial system.
Right. And I think too, the reason I had that question even is because Jesus, it talks so much about how Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. Like he is the ultimate perfect lamb that was slain for our sin. And back then in the Old Testament, we read that every time there was sacrifices made in the temple. And so I had the thought like, I've been to synagogue, I've been to temple, but for one, temple and synagogue are different,
Yeah,
that word,
yeah,
which you could talk about. But also, when I've been, I'm thinking, I've never seen a chicken sacrifice. I've never seen lambs like sacrifice, none of that.
right.
So I'm thinking, how are they cleared of their sins? Like, if they're not doing that, how are they cleared
Yeah.
of their sin?
No, that opens up a lot of important information. So, to start with, as you mentioned, the temple and the synagogue.
Yes.
So today, people know there are temples that are Jewish places of worship. Let's say, right?
Yes.
The temple originally was the temple in Jerusalem.
Okay. Specific temple.
Specifically, the temple is the temple in Jerusalem. Now, like I said, there's all these places that the synagogues, let's
Synagogues.
say, but they're called temples. But those are typically in the Reform temple, Reform synagogue movement. Reform meaning more liberal, more modern, and so on. Traditional synagogues still call themselves synagogues. And the word synagogue actually is a Greek word which means gathering. Ironically, it actually means the same thing as the word church, because the word church in the Greek is ecclesia, which is literally just means a gathering of people that have authority. Synagogues comes from the same type of word, gathering. Okay, so the synagogue started back in Babylon during the Babylonian time, after the destruction of the first temple. And then, of course, they continued. So even during the time of the second temple, during Yeshua's time, there were synagogues where Jews went and offered prayers,
Right.
not sacrifices. Sacrifices were only for the temple.
Right. And so currently, Jewish people are not sacrificing for their sins anymore because the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Now, don't forget, before the temple, you might wonder what would they do it, because there was no temple during Moses' time, but yet God commanded all these sacrifices. And by the way, not all the sacrifices were for sin. Some of them were fellowship offerings or peace offerings or just thanksgiving offerings to God. But almost all of them, there was one that was a grain offering that didn't involve animal sacrifices. But there were all kinds of different sacrifices that were brought, different festivals for the Shabbat, for the different feasts, and so on. But before the temple, they did it in the wilderness. They had the ark that traveled around, right, for the 40 years before they entered into the promised land. And they were giving the sacrifices during all that time. And God gave very specific instructions on the tabernacle. We read about those in the chapters 21 through 40 in Exodus. And then Leviticus begins the actual sacrificial system and the different sacrifices.
Right. And so there's a verse too. So that answers that question. I want to get just narrowed down to, the question, answer,
Sure.
answer.
Yeah.
So we're very clear. Okay. So the first question, why don't they sacrifice in the temple?
Temple was destroyed.
Temple's destroyed.
And God
There's no temple.
There's no temple. God was very specific. He said to bring the offerings to the place that he designates.
Okay.
Okay, so and when they were in the wilderness, that was the place. When they come into the promised land, there was another place, a place called Shiloh.
Okay. And currently,
There was Jerusalem when Solomon built the temple.
Right.
And then that temple was destroyed, and there was no place for 70 years, and then they rebuilt the temple.
Okay.
70 AD, when the second temple was destroyed, and since then till now, there is no temple.
Okay. And I think it's interesting because there's now no new designated place. And all this time, there hasn't been a new designated place yet.
That's correct.
However, I think with that, and I think that could be a separate discussion for a part 2, probably on replacement theology. I think that's a big thing. But how might that play a role with how we're the temple? Is that part of that, considering this verse, Hebrews 10:10? And by that will, we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Or Hebrews 10:14, for by a single offering, he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. And then I'll do one more in 1 Peter 3:18. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. So could you answer to that?
Right. So there's a lot there.
Yeah.
So first of all, the book of Hebrews, the great book. Studied it quite a bit. Hebrews was written to Jewish people, obviously,
Yes.
right? But there's a lot in the book of Hebrews that refer back to the temple and to the sacrificial system. So there's a good evidence that those that the book of Hebrews was written to were priests that had experience in the temple system. But don't forget, in the first century, the temple system had become corrupted. Mm-hmm. The priesthood had become corrupted. So there's evidence that these people had left Jerusalem. They were living outside of Israel. And the writer was writing to them to encourage them to remember that Yeshua is the ultimate sacrifice. Mm-hmm. That because they were because of persecution, perhaps considering falling back into just traditional Judaism, which was a safer place to be in the Roman world than as followers of Yeshua. So, so that's one thing. So the writer of Hebrews is connecting the sacrifice of Yeshua, the one-time sacrifice for all time, not sacrifices that had to be done over and over every year, Yom Kippur, the atonement and so forth. But Yeshua is the one time for all time sacrifice.
Okay, so are you saying then that if the temple were to be built tomorrow, let's say, we should be sacrificing as Jewish people again? Like, would we need to continue sacrificing?
Well, that's a big if.
What do you mean?
Well, the temple is not built,
Yeah.
but it will be
Yeah.
because there is prophetic scriptures, Ezekiel and so on, that there will be a third temple in the future, right? And apparently there will be sacrifices.
Okay.
So the answer is yes. And
Like God never intended for
the
Jewish people to
difference
stop.
is, right, well, so the difference is there won't be sacrifice for sin. Why? Wouldn't there
Because
be?
the
Same
lamb
thing
that
that
was
you
slain.
just read.
Jesus.
Yeah, he became the one time for all time sacrifice. So but the bigger question is where do we go if we don't believe in Jesus? If we don't believe in Yeshua as our atonement, as our sacrifice, which for most people, most Jewish people don't.
Right.
And the answer is there is none. So what happened? When
Sin
the
leads
temple
to
was
death.
destroyed, the followers of Yeshua. So there was a window of time between the death, burial, and resurrection of Yeshua in approximately 33, let's say, AD, to the destruction of the temple, which was 40 years later, 70 AD. So we read in the book of Acts, the followers of Yeshua, they were going to the temple. Paul was going to the temple. They were giving sacrifice. So there was this overlap between Yeshua and the destruction of the temple, right? Well, the sacrifices were still going on. And so, but then the temple was destroyed. And now there's a problem. What do? There's no
Right.
more sacrifices. So they came up with a new system, the Jewish people did. So there were many, many Jewish people that were followers of Yeshua, and they knew that he was the ultimate sacrifice. But then the Jewish leadership and the other Jewish people that rejected his messiahship, what were they to do?
Okay. Different question. But, okay, so now since there's no temple, what are they doing for their sin,
Right.
to cover their sin?
So there was a group of rabbis.
They as in the Jewish people, just so we're clear. What are the Jewish people doing to sacrifice?
So there was a group of rabbis after the destruction of the temple that left Jerusalem. They were given special permission, actually, by the Romans. Don't forget, Jerusalem was under siege because of the revolt. There was a revolt by the Jewish people, or at least one segment of the Jewish people, towards the Romans, which ended with the destruction of the temple and the Romans coming in and conquering Jerusalem, in effect. But there was special permission given to a group of rabbis to leave and go to a town outside of Jerusalem where they developed the first rabbinic school, so to speak, outside of Jerusalem.
Okay.
And they developed a system that replaced the temple system. And that system consisted of prayer, good deeds, and charity.
Wait.
That would
What did
replace-
God have to say about this?
Well,
Like,
God already spoke. He
Yeah.
sent Yeshua.
that's what I'm saying. I'm like,
I'm
how
not
did
saying it was a God thing, but that was what they did.
the
to
rabbis
preserve-
just decided?
Right.
Okay.
But in fairness, when you think about it, in a way, God did use that as a system to preserve a sense of unity amongst Jewish people, even though it wasn't what God's purpose was. Obviously, it was for the Jewish people to receive Yeshua as the atonement.
Well,
So,
it became about prayer and good works.
yes, to this day.
And is that probably then leading into why they're trying to still uphold the law and keep all the commandments?
Right. So if you remember in the Gospels, there was already this oral, what we call the oral law. Mm-hmm. Okay. Hebrew, it's Torah Baal Peh, from the oral, literally from the mouth, right? So there was an oral law that was debated, right? There are different schools of rabbinic interpretation, how to apply the Torah to everyday life. It's a valid question, right? What is Shabbat? Day of rest. What is rest? What is work? All those things. And we've talked about that in previous episodes, right?
Shout out. If you guys are looking for other content, you can go to our page and find
That's
more
right.
videos.
That's right. So there were valid reasons to apply, what is Shabbat, what is work, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. But now, with the destruction of the temple, they believed that they had to write these things down, and they had to make it more, focused on. Now there's no temple, so what are we going to do? And many of the leaders were killed in the siege of Jerusalem as well. Many Jews were killed by the Romans at that time, and then there was another revolt later, which maybe we can talk about another time. So, so now what do we do? Okay, well, prayer, good deeds, charity averts the judgment.
Yeah.
And then they developed the rabbinic system of observances and so forth that applied to all holidays and Jewish life. And that was the basis of what we call the Talmud today. The Mishnah and the Gemara, which together form the Talmud, which, again, that could be definitely another episode
and
or two.
Yeah, and I think that leads into even that thought with Ephesians 2:8-9 that says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast." And I think that's where there's that difference, where we recognize that Jesus died for our sins, like he bore our sin and shame on the cross. And because of that, we have the free gift of salvation, that it's not my works. Otherwise, I'm constantly trying to earn God's love, earn God's acceptance, earn favor versus being freely given.
And it's interesting because the next verse I think is also important, which says that for we are his workmanship.
Yes.
We are his, model that he created. We are his workmanship that he created for good deeds.
Yeah.
In other words, that he ordained beforehand for us. So there's this balance, which unfortunately many one side or the other. So, grace, we're saved by grace, not through works, but yet we're saved for works.
Yes.
Right? So there's the balance there.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, in Judaism, it's way over on the works. It's all about works. And unfortunately, in many streams of Christianity, the grace is, it's all about the grace.
Yeah, or I have faith in Jesus, so it's not about how I act.
Yeah, I can do anything
I
want.
So what, I can just accept Jesus as my Savior and then live however I want and I'm fine?
Right.
No. You live for God. You have works overflow out of gratitude to God. That's a natural outpouring. Like, God, thank you so much for saving me. I'm going to live my life back to you. Like, you died for me, I'll live for you type of thing. Whereas in Judaism, it's very works. And I think we've talked about this, but a lot of Jewish people, at least that I've known growing up, didn't even believe in God. They were Jewish by culture or tradition, or their mom was Jewish, or,
Right. And, the thing is, when we started out talking about the sacrifices, right? And that God, in his mercy, set up a system for us to draw, then back in the day under Moses, to draw near to him, Korban.
Yes.
Going back to that concept. And I was thinking about, as we were talking, that what God intended was when they brought the animal, the individual offeror was to lay his hands on that animal and confess his sins over that animal. And there was something called the exchange of life. And so as he confessed his sin over that animal, who was innocent, right? Mm-hmm. Animal is innocent. But yet God allowed the sin of the offeror, the person, that sin to be transferred to the animal, and the innocence of the animal transferred to the person.
Wow.
So now I'm free of sin if I brought that animal. But guess who has the sin?
The animal.
And what has to happen to
To
that
die.
animal? Animal has to die because the wages of sin is death.
Yep. And yeah, so
Yeah.
and they're not doing that anymore
So
though.
it's the exchange of life principle.
Right.
But even back then, it became ritual,
Yeah.
became just a religious thing. So this idea of God's grace being turned into religion been going on forever.
Yeah.
But it wasn't intended to be a ritual. It was intended for the person to be able to now come to God in his innocence. But when you think about it, Paul wrote using the same picture in 1 Corinthians, where he says, "He who knew no sin, meaning
Became
Yeshua,
sin.
became sin for us, so that we might have
The righteousness of God
in him."
Yeah.
Same idea. We lay our hands on Yeshua, and our sin is transferred to him. And because the wage of sin is death, he had to die for our sin, and so that we can be innocent of that sin. Because his sacrifice is an eternal sacrifice, one time for all time. Because someone would say, well, yeah, that happened 2,000 years ago. Yeah, but it's eternal. It's as if it's happening right now for anyone who chooses to lay his hands
Because he's
on
not
him.
dead. Because he rose from the grave, so that's why it's eternal.
His sacrifice is eternal.
Yeah, an animal, it dies, it's gone.
Right. And
but Jesus
and he confirmed
died and came back.
that reality by being raised from the dead.
Wow.
Yeah.
Look at God.
We can draw near Korban.
Yep, so true. Well, guys, we hope that helped answer that question. If you have other questions or want deeper understanding, comment down below or reach out. We would love to talk about it more with you. But I think that's about it, right?
I think it's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the message really is not about all these rituals and religious activity, but the Korban,
Yeah.
the drawing near in our hearts to him.
Yeah.
And that's what we're called to do. And God is drawing us. He's drawing you to him.
Yeah. And I think the takeaway, too, from my perspective is that it's all about Jesus. Like, there's nothing we could do to earn God's love or his approval. It's all a matter of Jesus, died for us. We live for him, like I had said earlier. And that, to me, is the biggest takeaway of it all, that our life is gratitude back to him for what he's done for us. So we love you so much, and we will see you next week. Bye.
Hey everyone, really excited to share about a book that I wrote, been working on for the last year and a half, and it's finally came out recently, and it's called An Atheist, a Drug Dealer, and a Rabbi, and that's me. And it's really, the subtitle is A Redemption Story from Generation to Generation. It's got story of my life, some family stories from generations back, and really, hopefully an encouragement to all who read it, about what God is able to do to take an atheist and a drug dealer and bring him to a place of faith and walking with God. The book is available at Barnes & Nobles and on Amazon. You can go to Amazon and put in my name, and it'll pop up and anywhere where books are sold. And be happy to hear your comments or questions about it as well.